Hello, Wanderers, and welcome to the last installment of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, this year at least. I'd like to leave you with the story of an old house and the strange noises that go on inside. I hope that you are ready for the story Sounds from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark 2. The house was near the beach. It was a big old place where nobody had lived for years. From time to time, somebody would force a window or a door and spend the night there, but never longer. 3 fishermen, caught in a storm, took shelter there one night. With some dry wood they found inside, they made a fire in the fireplace. They lay down on the floor and tried to get some sleep, but none of them slept that night. First, they heard footsteps upstairs. It sounded like there were several people moving back and forth. When one fisherman called, "Who's up there?" the footsteps stopped. Then they heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. Blood began to drip from the ceiling into the room where the fishermen huddled. A small red pool formed on the floor and soaked into the wood. A door upstairs crashed shut, and again the woman screamed. "Not me!" she cried. It sounded as if she was running, her high heels tapping wildly down the hall. "I'll get you!" a man shouted, and the floor shook as he chased her. Then silence. There wasn't a sound until the man who had shouted began to laugh. Long peals of horrible laughter filled the house. It went on and on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. When finally it stopped, the fishermen heard someone coming down the stairs, dragging something heavy that bumped on each step. They heard him drag it through the front hall and out the door. The door opened, and it slammed shut. Again, silence. Suddenly, a flash of lightning filled the house with a green blaze of light. A ghastly face stared at the fishermen from the hallway. Then came a crash of thunder. Terrified, they ran out into the storm. And so we assumed that they simply made it back to their boat and sailed into the night. They may have weathered the storm, or capsized. They may have made it back home to their families, or met an early, watery grave. But no, the fishermen did not sail away, for the journey down to the boat was far too perilous. As they stood out in the freezing rain and battering winds without even a coat on, they noticed that the storm had flooded the channel, covering the road to the house. This put them on a small island, and they couldn't possibly escape with the storm raging. As they stood shivering in the rain, the youngest, Jack, spoke up. "If we stay out in the storm, we could die of hypothermia." A large branch from a nearby tree, swept up by the wind, was carried between the fishermen. They all jumped out of the way to avoid being smacked as it bounced by. "Or hit by something," he yelled again. "Aye. There's no way we could survive staying out here. We'll have to take our chances with the house," Captain Roland shouted back over the crash of another thunderclap. "Come on! Double time!" The men pushed their way through the storm back to the dark house on the hill. As they made it to the house, Roland yanked open the front door and held it while the other 2 fishermen rushed inside. The wind battered at Roland as he pulled the door shut. Looking around the dusty house, David, his first mate, said, Did we all see the same thing? A pale face in the hallway?" "Aye, I saw it, but it could have been a trick of the storm," Roland stated. "But that doesn't explain the noises we heard from upstairs." Jack pointed to the ceiling. "We should check it out before we settle in then," Roland answered. The 3 men nodded in agreement and made their way up the hallway stairs. David kept a close eye on the staircase for traces of blood or dents, but while the boards were splintered and warped, there were no signs of a body being dragged down the stairs. The dust still appeared to be undisturbed. As they made their way to the top floor of the house, they found themselves in a small landing. The room curved around the stairs in the corner to make an L shape with 3 connecting doors. The first door, closest to the stairs, was slightly open, and a draft from inside the room made it sway slightly. They saw on the other side of the banister that there were 2 old couches. One of them flipped on its side, blocking a door to a room in the corner. David noticed that the bottom of the couch was tinged black. The door on the opposite side of the railing had a large hole directly in the middle of it. David pointed to the door next to the stairs. "The sounds were coming from inside that room. It's directly above where we were sleeping," he whispered. Roland nodded and cautiously made his way to the door. He placed a hand on the chipped wood and slowly creaked it open. Jack and David followed closely behind him as he stepped into the room. There was a large king-size bed on the right side of the room, with large tears in the covers as if someone had cut them up with a sharp object. There were bookshelves lining the back wall, but most of the shelves were empty, and the books that remained looked like they would disintegrate if someone touched them. They moved as one to the center of the room where the boards had been stained with dark liquid. Roland bent down and rubbed a finger across the wood, and rubbed his fingers together, frowning. "This wood is dry, or at least there's no blood." "Then what did we see downstairs?" Jack demanded. "We all saw the blood dripping from the ceiling, didn't we?" "Maybe we should go down," David began, but a blood-curdling scream rang out from somewhere in the house. The 3 fishermen stood stock still inside the room, frozen with fear. Jack shook himself and crept closer to the bedroom door, poking his head out into the hall. He could hear a thudding sound, as if someone was chopping wood with an axe, but much more frantic. Jack glanced back at his companions and saw them shaking their heads. The sound of plates shattering against a wall came from downstairs as another scream rang out. Jack silently motioned for the others to follow him as he stalked out of the room and down the stairs. He peered through the banister towards the door closest to the front of the house. He could hear a man and a woman screaming from the other side. The door to the bedroom didn't move. It looked like the other 2 were not coming with him. I knew I shouldn't have stayed here," the woman yelled as another plate crashed against the wall. "I should have taken my chances with the storm." Another crash. Jack slunk down further to get closer to the door. He pressed himself against the wall next to it as he glanced back up. He wished the other 2 had come along. A man laughed on the other side, the same laugh Jack had heard before. "Stay or go. It wouldn't have mattered." The man grunted, and there was another thud as something heavy struck the wood. There was another crash from a plate. "You're dead either way," the man yelled. Jack heard a sickening crunch, followed by 2 staggered steps. Something dropped to the floor, and he heard a raspy breathing, quiet, but unmistakable. He wanted to run into the room, but his body was frozen. He thought about running away, back out into the storm, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything. From the other side of the door, he heard the sound of someone trying to crawl closer to the door, followed by that laugh that was so jubilant, as if it delighted in what had just happened. Jack steeled himself and demanded his hand to move. Slowly, his hand lifted from his side and moved closer to the door. His fingers curled around the doorknob and twisted. He heard the sound of a click as the latch slid out of the frame's socket. He took a deep breath and whipped the door open, peering inside. The room was dark and dusty as the others, as if no one had been here in years. He stepped inside, glancing left and right in case of an ambush, but nothing came at him. The door shut behind him, and he rushed back to catch it. The handle turned, and the door swung open easily. Jack let out a sigh of relief and took a long look around the room. It looked like a kitchen, with a large island in the center, a stove in one of the corners, and a sink off to the side. Around the room, there were open drawers full of kitchen utensils and cabinets with canned food in them. As he moved further into the room, his feet crunched against something. He looked down and saw old pieces of china, broken at his feet. His eyes grew wide as he shouted, "Captain! David! Come down here!" He heard soft footsteps come from upstairs. The only way he could really tell if they were coming was the slight squeak from the old floorboards as they made their way down. "What did you see?" David asked. The two fishermen stood out in the hallway, staring at him quizzically. Nothing, really," Jack replied, looking down at his feet. "But I heard a fight between a man and a woman. It sounded like the same man from before, but the woman was different, I think. And I heard them having a fight. Someone was throwing things, and I think there was someone swinging a weapon because..." He trailed off, not sure how to continue. I think she died." Captain Roland moved past Jack into the kitchen to look around. "Aye, looks like there was a fight here." He kept his voice low. "There are axe marks in the countertop around the room." He ran a finger across the large mark where the counter had been split. David took a few cautious steps into the room and noticed a door on the far side. "What's in there?" He stepped closer and placed both hands against it, pressing his ear near the door to listen for anything on the other side. Not hearing anything, he grabbed the knob and turned it as smoothly as he could. The door swung open to reveal a pantry. David squinted, trying to make out the dark shapes on the shelves. It looked to be more old cans of food, but then he glanced down. Staring back at him were two pitch-black empty holes from the eyes of a skeleton. Its jaw hung open as if it was still screaming in pain. David leapt back with a yelp. The other two men came running up behind him to look into the pantry. "Looks like she got caught with an axe in the chest," Roland said. How do you know?" Jack stammered. "Look at the ribs." Roland stepped closer to the bones. "These are split halfway to where they should end." He picked up one of the broken ribs and held it up for the others to see. The bone had jagged edges where it had been cracked in half. "I'm sure it was the same axe that made those other cuts around the room." "But how do you know it was a woman?" David asked. "The pelvic bone is too wide to be a man, at least in most cases. And judging from Jack heard, it sounds like the woman met a gruesome end." "Then we should leave. There's no way we're going to survive if we stay in here." "No, Jack was right. There's no way we could survive out in that storm. Besides, this body is years old. I don't think we're in any immediate danger here." "But what about all the sounds we keep hearing? There's something here, and I don't think we're going to make it out if we stay here much longer," Jack said. "We'll make it through just fine. We've weathered worse storms than this," Roland said. He lifted a finger and pointed at Jack. "But we need to stick together. No more running off without us." Jack looked down at his feet again and mumbled, "Okay." "What was that?" Roland asked. Jack looked up at Roland. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now let's all get back to the living room. We won't be leaving there until the storm passes." The two other fishermen gave a hearty, "Aye, aye," and they walked together back to the living room. They stayed awake, next to the dwindling fire, as they listened. An hour passed, and still there were no more sounds. Jack was starting to nod off when he heard soft, limping footsteps from outside the room. He got up, but Roland stayed him with a hand. Come out," came a muffled voice from the hallway. Jack looked at David and mouthed, "What was that?" David's face was pale as he looked at Jack and shrugged. The limping footsteps made their way up the stairs. As the footsteps made their way into the next floor, Roland moved to the doorway. He creaked the door open. He stuck his ear out the door to listen better while he had a hand up to the others. A light rapping came from upstairs. "Little pigs, let me come in." There was a pause. "Not by the hair of your chinny chin." Another pause. "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in." A loud bang rang throughout the house as a woman screamed from upstairs. Another bang, and another. The banging was relentless, and yet Roland kept his hand raised as it continued. "We can't just stand here," Jack yelled over the banging. "We have to do something." He rushed at Roland, but David stood in his way. "What are you going to do if you get up there?" he asked. "Are you going to save her? You aren't strong enough. You'll get killed." Jack looked at David straight in the eyes. "I'm not going to listen to another person die while I cower in another room again. Now let me by!" He threw a punch at David's face. David put a hand up and pushed the blow out of the way and pushed Jack back, sending him to the floor. Roland came rushing over to put himself in between the two. "There's no time for this!" Jack and David clamped their mouths shut at his roar. "Now pick yourselves up, we're gonna go find out what's going on up there." When he finished speaking, Jack picked himself off the floor. Jack looked at the other two fishermen and noticed that they were not speaking. They were looking up at the ceiling. "What? Are there more noises?" Jack asked. "No. And that's the problem," came Roland's answer. "There's no more banging." Jack listened, and indeed the banging had stopped. All he could hear was the wind buffeting the house from outside. There was a light outside and a crash of thunder. David held up a finger and turned his nose upward, visibly sniffing the air. "Do you smell that? It smells like smoke, I think." The men all turned their noses to the air, and the smell was unmistakable. Their fire had gone out by now, and the three fishermen all glanced at each other. "If the house is on fire, then we need to find the source," Roland said. "We stick together, though. Follow close behind and don't go wandering off." He opened the door to the hallway, and the two other men fell in line behind him. They ran over to the kitchen, and Roland poked his head inside. "Nothing in here! Quick, up the stairs!" Jack rushed past the two of them and up the staircase. The upper floor was hazy, and he saw an orange glow from the other side of the room that was blocked by the couch. He hurried over to it as his companions trotted up the stairs after him. He heard a man on the other side of the door. "Ah! Ah! Ah! Help! There's a fire! Anybody!" A fist pounded on the door from the other side. Jack was at the couch, ready to move it, but he hesitated. He had listened to 3 different women being murdered in this house. If there really was someone on the other side of the door, did he really want to let them out? Roland was next to him then. "Come on, boy! We need to put that fire out!" Jack nodded grimly and grabbed the couch. "Please, someone help me! I'm burning alive!" came the sound of a man on the other side of the door. The 3 men hauled the couch out of the way just enough for someone to squeeze inside. Smoke billowed out from under the door in plumes as Jack leapt over the couch to get to the door. Before he could open it, he heard the sound of glass shattering and the man's screams become more distant. The door thumped against the couch, and Jack shimmied inside. But by the time he got in, the smoke in the room had gone, and the orange glow was nowhere to be seen. He looked to see that the room was blackened. There was a charred old desk off to one side, and behind it, a broken window. Jack heard his friends come into the room behind him as he moved closer to the shattered window. The wind had started to die down as he looked at the base of the house. There, spread eagle, face down, was another skeleton. Its bones were blackened and charred, and some were missing. As the captain and his first mate came up behind him, they stared out the window at the sea in the distance. There was hardly any rain falling now, only a light sprinkle. There was a chill wind as the three fishermen looked at the sunrise. Orange and yellow light streamed through the clouds at the beginning of a brand new day. And that's the story. What happened in that house so long ago? How much anguish must there have been to stain the house with screams of terror? Well, unfortunately, I do not have those answers. I'd like to thank Monster Music for providing the background track to the story, and I wish you all a very terrifying Hallows Eve. I hope to see you all again next year, if you survive that long, and that you all keep an ear out for those terrifying things that await you in the dark.